Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 166, The Great Western Schism, part 1, which is also episode 3 of season 9, The Reformation Before the Reformation. Now, if you're a long-standing listener to the History of the Germans, you will already know that sometime in the late 14th century the Catholic Church broke apart into two, and then 30 years later into three different obediences, three popes residing in different places and being recognized by different nations. But what you may not know is how exactly this had happened. Why did the exact self-same cardinals elect one pope in 1378 and then another one only 4 months later? Who was taking the lead in attempts to resolve the crisis, and why did all of these attempts fail for nearly 40 years? How far did they go in forcing the various papal contenders to come to the negotiation table? And how ridiculous were the Pope's attempts to wriggle out of that? All that we will look into this week in part 1 of the story of the Great Western Schism. But before we start, it's the usual big thank you to all our supporters who've signed up on patreon.com/historyofthegermans or who have made a one-time donation on historyofthegermans.com/support. It is you who keep this show free and clear of ever more irritating advertising. This show does not expose you to online psychologists, room-sharing apps, or crypto exchanges. Has anybody actually ever found out why there's an inverse correlation between the quality of a brand and the ubiquity of its podcast advertising? Anyway, today we thank Alex G, Bruno P, Diark A, Charles Y, Daniel N, Kurt O, and Kai B, who've already signed up. And with that, back to the show. Now, I occasionally choose to split my stories into two parts. One where I talk about what happened, and then where I wax lyrically about what it meant for the political, economic, or cultural fabric of society. Now, when it comes to the Western Schism, this is not an option. It is the only way to do it. And since resistance is futile, let's start with part 1. What the heck happened? So let's go back to 1303. As you may remember, and mainly because I mention it in practically every episode for the last 6 months, the popes had moved to Avignon after the slap of Agnani. If you do not know what that is, go back to episode 92, the papal epilogue. For 70 years, the popes resided in this gorgeous Provençal city, very much enjoying the safety and security that came with the French monarch being just across the river and the murderous Roman aristocrats several hundred miles away. The popes did not intend to stay for long. They gradually built themselves suitable accommodation. The Palais des Papes, the papal palace in Avignon, was begun by the rather austere Pope Benedict XII and then hugely expanded by the much more worldly Clement VI and his successors. By the late 14th century, the papal palace covered 15,000 square meters, making it the largest and most splendid residence in the whole of Europe. It was built both as a fortress and as a palace, so its walls were 3 meters thick and it sports a total of 12 towers, one of which was originally 60 meters tall. At the same time, it held a grand audience hall where the Pope received ambassadors, as well as an enormous papal chapel used for religious ceremonies and the conclave for the election of a new Pope. All very comfortable, safe, and secure. Basically the exact opposite of what Rome looked like at the same time. But as there is no free lunch, not even for a pope, this safety and security came at a price. And that price was submission to the wishes of the French crown. The first pope to reside in the south of France, Clement V, was made to put his predecessor on trial for heresy on the French king's command. If that wasn't enough, that same pope signed off on the dissolution of the Templars that resulted in a raid on this rich chivalric order by the French king and the burning of its grandmaster and several others. So, not that comfortable after all. Clement V's successors were working hard at extracting themselves from the French dominance. One of these efforts led to the election of Emperor Henry VII, the forefather of Karl IV, Wenceslas, and Sigismund, who lifted the House of Luxembourg from mere counts to the royal and imperial title. Episode 146, if you want to check it out. But ultimately, the Pope could not really be independent, as long as he remained within arrow shot of a French garrison. So all throughout this period, the popes talked about going back to Rome. The problem was, however, that Rome and the Papal States had slipped out of the control of the papal administration. Many of the larger cities, Bologna, Ferrara, and Perugia, had first turned into city communes and then had become signorie, ruled by autocratic dictators. Rome itself had also asserted its independence, being ruled by a senate that was dominated by the great Roman families, the Colonna, the Rossini, and several others. There had even been a popular uprising by Cola di Rienzi, or Rienzo, that did, however, last only for a brief period. It took a Spanish cardinal, Gil Alvarez Carrillo de Albornoz, who fought tirelessly over a period of 13 years, from 1353 to 1367, to restore papal control over the Patrimonium Petri. He made liberal use of sellswords who had been released from duty when the 100 Years' War went into its hiatus. These men were in equal measure effective as they were cruel, and they were also entirely coin-operated. As long as Albornoz had money, he was able to subdue one town or region after another. Whenever money was short, activity slowed down, and the process went into reverse. These companies of mercenaries were a serious menace, because if they had not secured a new contract for their services, they went freelance. They would appear before the gates of a city with their siege equipment and guns, and make an offer the citizens could not refuse. Pay us some fine gold and we will go to the neighboring town, or endure a siege followed by a sacking. The companies did even threaten Avignon itself and forced the Pope to pay them off twice. And each time they received not only a lot of fine gold, but also forgiveness for their sins. Bottom line was that by 1365 the papacy had regained sufficient control of Rome that they could think about going back. The Pope at the time, Urban V, left Avignon on April 30th, 1367, and arrived in the Holy City on October 16th. Though the French king had told him, quoting Quo Vadis, that he would be crucified upon arrival as St. Peter had been, Urban V miraculously survived his journey and even his stay in Rome. He spent 2 years there. But without Albornoz, who had died in 1367, he was unable to control the rebellious cities. Even Rome rose up against him, and by the end of 1370 he was back in Avignon, where he then promptly died, a punishment for his cowardice, as various saints and mystics claimed. The next pope, Gregory XI, vowed again to go back to Rome for good. But it took him 7 years to rebuild his authority in the Papal States. It also did not help that relations between the Church and Florence had deteriorated. That was in part due to the success of Gregory's troops that left Florence feeling threatened. And in 1374, the Pope prohibited the export of grain to Florence, where a famine had broken out. So anti-papal, or more specifically anti-French papal sentiment reached fever pitch, culminating in a war between Florence and its long-standing oldest ally, the papacy. The Florentines called it the War of the Seven Saints, referring to the 7 leaders of their town fighting a godless pope. This war was initially going pretty well for Florence. One papal city after another joined their league, calling for a return of their ancient liberties. Ultimately, only Rome itself stood with Gregory. To relieve his lands from occupation, Gregory hired 2 of the greatest mercenary companies of the time, the Bretons and John Hawkwood's White Company. Just in case this sounds familiar, the Golden Company in the Game of Thrones is modeled on Hawkwood's soldiers. The 2 companies did meet with some success, mainly by burning down the countryside around Bologna and starving the city into submission. The real turning point in the war came when the Breton Company was staying in their winter quarters in the small town of Cesena. As so often happened, one of the mercenary soldiers ended up in a brawl with some local butchers. The brawl expanded as both sides called upon their friends for help. Within hours, the the citizens of Cesena were running round shouting, "Death to the Bretons and the pastors of the church." The papal legate, who was in charge of these military operations, a certain Robert of Geneva, withdrew his remaining forces to the citadel and called his other forces, those of Sir John Hawkwood, to come to his aid. And the White Company arrived a few days later, with all of its 4,000 well-trained mercenary fighters, their highly polished armor sparkling in the winter sun. By the time the day was out, the shine had come off their armor, and their white surcoats were drenched in blood. How many citizens of Cesena perished in the massacre is unknown. People across Italy told each other about the countless women who had been raped, about babies whose heads were smashed against walls, and unimaginable bestialities committed by these monsters. And they kept repeating the name of the man who had overall command at Cesena, the cardinal legate, Robert of Geneva, who they said had run around with his mercenaries shouting, "I want blood, 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 kill them all." Remember this name. He may come back again. The timing of the massacre at Cesena could not have been worse, because just weeks earlier Pope Gregory XI had finally made landfall in Italy. There are multiple depictions of Gregory XI's holy entry into Rome on January 17, 1378, all showing him arriving at his splendid palace on a white horse or mule, handing out gold coins while bystanders, bishops, cardinals, monks and nuns watch adoringly. Not quite how it happened. Gregory XI arrived surrounded by 2,000 armed men. Upon brief inspection, it became clear that the Lateran Palace, home of the popes for centuries, was so dilapidated there was no way the Holy Father could live there. So the whole cavalcade turned and set off across the Tiber to the Vatican City. There, suitable accommodation could be found near St. Peter's, and that is where the popes have lived ever since. Now, the massacre of Cesena may have been another nail in the already rickety coffin of the papacy, in particular its French-speaking popes, but it did break the spirit of the Florentine League. The War of the Seven Saints was over, and the Pope had regained the Patrimonium Petri. And that is when he died. What happened next has been disputed less by contemporaries than by French and Italian historians for centuries. So Gregory XI, when he saw his end approaching, he issued a papal bull, changing the terms of the papal elections to make sure a new pope could be elected almost instantly after his death. Many authors interpret this as Gregory being afraid of a schism and hence wanted a swift, if unconventional, election. I find that quite honestly nonsense. If he had indeed been afraid of a schism, legitimacy of the newly elected pontiff should have been at the absolute forefront of his mind. Hence, he would have left instructions to make sure that every aspect of this upcoming conclave would have been in accordance with the letter of canon law. By suggesting an expedient election, even one without a formal conclave if necessary, he made it even more likely that the election would end up contested. In any event, the cardinals decided to hold a formal conclave. They met in the Basilica of St. Peter's, all 16 of them. 4 of them were Italians, 1 was Spanish, and the rest are often called French. However, within that group, there were 5 from the Limousin region. The reason for that was that 3 of the last 4 popes had been from the Limousin area, and these guys were all their nephews and other relatives. Hence, the other French, led by Cardinal Robert of Geneva, the butcher of Cesena, there he is again, wanted anything but another Limousin pope. This faction also included the Spanish cardinal, Peter de Luna, another name very much worth remembering. As the conclave opened and the cardinals marched across St. Peter's Square, they saw a large crowd of Romans who made their wishes clear. Romano lo volemo, we want a Roman. Some would later write that they shouted much harsher words than that, something along the lines of, if you don't give us a Roman, we will kill you all. Once the doors had closed, the conclave began in earnest. Robert of Geneva had already canvassed his colleagues and, realizing his hands were still a bit too blood-drenched to put on the papal mitre, is alleged to have declared that, quote, "We shall have no one else as Pope than the Archbishop of Bari." The Limousine faction too realized that they had no chance to push their own candidate. So the Cardinal of Limoges rose and declared, quote, "I propose the election of a man to whom the people cannot seriously object and who would show himself favorably to us. I elect the Archbishop of Bari to be Pontiff of the Holy and Catholic Church, and this I do freely and willingly." End quote. Cardinal Orsini, another one who had hoped to move up in the church stakes, resigned himself to the inevitable and declared he would vote with the majority. So, who was this Archbishop of Bari everyone was suddenly so keen on? His name was Bartolomeo Prignani. He was, as the name indicates, an Italian. Not a Roman, but a man from the Kingdom of Naples. The reason everyone in the College of Cardinals could so readily agree on him was, well, that they all knew him. Prignano had spent the last 14 years in Avignon as a diplomat for the Curia, and he had recently been elevated to Vice-Chancellor for Italy, aka he was the guy with the key to the money box. He was an insider, someone who had been useful and deferential to these great princes of the church in the past, and who they expected he would continue to be exactly that. There was now only a bit of a technical problem. Prignano wasn't in the Vatican, and without his consent his election could not be formally concluded and announced. The cardinals immediately called for him to come to the palace, along with a number of other prelates, so as not to give away their decision. It took a while for Prignano to get across the city that was teeming with people. The crowd outside was now getting restless. They saw prelates arriving, some of them French. Rumors went round the cardinals had chosen another Frenchman. The shouts, we want a Roman, grew louder and louder, and the crowd moved towards the Basilica of St. Peter. Meanwhile, the cardinals had returned to a chapel inside the palace complex and moved on to formally elect Prignano. Now, this is important. It was after the cardinals had elected Prignano formally that the crowd burst into the palace, demanding to see who they had chosen. They said Bari, but that was misunderstood for another name, a Frenchman's name. Prignano was not there yet and could therefore not be shown to the crowd. In the absence of the elected pope, and most likely fearing for their lives, they dressed 90-year-old Cardinal Tebaldeschi, a Roman well known to the crowd, in papal robes and shoved him onto the throne. The old man protested, shouting, "I'm not the Pope, I'm not the Pope, I do not want to be the antipope. The Archbishop of Bari is Pope." Now, whether anyone heard him is unclear, because all the other cardinals had run away and left Tebaldeschi on his own with a mob. Some made it to Castel San Angelo, others went back to their fortified houses, and the future Pope, Bartolomeo Prignani, or as we should call him now, Pope Urban VI, hid in a small chamber inside the bowels of the Vatican Palace. The crowd sacked the palace and then moved on to the home of poor Tebaldeschi. It was a long-standing Roman tradition that the people were allowed to clean out the home of a new pope on the night of his election. And they still believed that the new pope was Tebaldeschi. The next day the cardinals, including Robert of Geneva, announced the election of Urban VI, and though he wasn't a Roman, the crowd was still satisfied. Over the next few weeks, various cardinals announced to all and sundry in Europe that they had freely and legally elected a new pope. On April 18th, 9 days after his election, Urban VI was crowned and then got to work. But, oh golly, he turned out to be nothing at all what the cardinals had expected. Instead of being that meek and malleable man he had pretended to be for all those years in Avignon, he flipped over into full-on autocratic rule. And not only that, he developed an unhealthy obsession with his former colleagues' finances. In his Easter Sunday sermon, he condemned churchmen who were perennially absent from their post while still collecting their benefices. It's a bit rich from a man who had been away from his archbishopric for 14 years, but here we go. Urban got the bit between his teeth. He tells the Cardinal of Amiens that he should live a more modest life and should please stop taking bribes from foreign ambassadors. And if not, he would strip him of his cardinal's rank. He called Cardinal Orsini a sot and had to be physically constrained from hitting the Cardinal of Limoges in the face. In the following weeks, his outburst became ever more extreme. He would have shouting matches again with the Cardinal of Amiens, who he had singled out as the worst of the lot. One time, when he was again screaming and cursing with his head turning from red to purple, Robert of Geneva demanded the Pope treated his cardinals with a bit more respect, or else. Urban's response was to threaten his cardinals wholesale with excommunication, even excommunication without the traditional 3 warnings. One after another, the cardinals slipped out of town under the pretext of the unhealthy summer climate. They gathered at Anagni. By August, 13 of the 16 cardinals who had elected Urban VI were in this pleasant little town about 65 kilometers from Rome. Of the other 3 who had elected Urban VI, 1 had died and 2 others had returned to Avignon. They invited Urban VI to join them, but he refused. It was apparent that Urban VI had not only changed, but in the minds of many cardinals had become mentally incapacitated. Modern historians are split down the middle. Some believe he had a psychotic episode brought on by the sudden realization of the enormity of his office. Others see him as a pious pontiff trying to reform the church, weed out its corruption, and running into heavy difficulties. The cardinals faced a dilemma. They definitely wanted to get rid of Urban VI, but under canon law, the only reason for a deposition of a pope was heresy. And that charge could not be made to stick, largely because Urban VI had been a papal diplomat who had never voiced any theological opinions one way or another. Calling him incompetent or not compos mentis was simply not a viable argument under canon law. But they did very much regret their choice and they wanted to get rid of him. So they resorted to another canon law concept, which was that acts made under duress were automatically invalid. On August 9th, 1378, the cardinals declared the election of Urban VI null and void because it was made out of fear of the Roman mob outside. And they declared that, as a consequence, the papal throne was vacant. The 13 cardinals present in Anagni then elected one of their own, the Cardinal Robert of Geneva, the Butcher of Cesena, to be pope. And Robert took the name Clement VII. Now, we could go into a lengthy discussion about the legitimacy of this act, and many historians have. Some point to the fact that the crowds broke into the Vatican in the end, and that the cardinals only escaped by putting papal robes on Cardinal Tebaldeschi. And that proves that the threat to their lives was real. Others argue that the cardinals were treating Urban VI as pope in the months after the election, and had even admitted that, quote, if he had behaved differently, he could have remained pope. For what it is worth, the Catholic Church believes that Urban's election was valid and that all popes that followed the Avignon obedience were antipopes. Now, I personally could not care either way, nor did the contemporaries in the 14th century, because for them and for us, the only thing that mattered was that we now have 2 competing popes. And this is not the first time this had happened, but on most previous occasions, these schisms had occurred as a consequence of the conflict between the papacy and the emperor. But this one is somewhat unusual because it resulted from an internal conflict within the church. Being the total pedant I am, I would like to point out, though, that there was at least one precedent, a conflict between Innocent II and Anaclet II. That too was a conflict within the church, or at least amongst rival factions in the city of Rome. Episode 46, if you want to check back. But I digress. Robert of Geneva, the Butcher of Cesena, and now Pope Clement VII, left Italy after a few weeks and settled back into Avignon. And so did all the other cardinals. Urban VI compensated for the loss by appointing 24 new cardinals. Clement VII took control of the papal administrative apparatus, which had largely stayed back in Avignon, while Urban VI built an entirely new papal infrastructure. The Western Christian world was now divided into the Roman obedience, i.e. the lands that recognized Urban VI as the legitimate pope, and the Avignon obedience, that are the parts who believed Clement VII was the rightful holder of the throne of St. Peter. So, who was recognizing which pope? The loyalties of at least two geographies were fairly predictable. Almost all of Italy sided with Urban VI. After the massacre at Cesena, no Italian wanted Robert of Geneva as their spiritual guide. And these considerations were overriding even the political calculus that had compelled Florence and others to wage the War of the Seven Saints against the papacy. Queen Joanna of Naples was initially leaning towards Clement, but her people made it abundantly clear to her that they would not support such a stance, and Naples, minus Joanna, went into the Roman camp. But the most crucial question was then whether France would side with Clement VII. Robert of Geneva was a cousin of Charles V of France, and the rulers of France have never hid the fact that they very much preferred the papacy to remain in Avignon. The Duke Louis of Anjou had warned Gregory XI against going to Rome, where he would indeed cause great harm to the church were he to die there. But Charles did not immediately decide. Instead, he called an assembly of learned men and clergy to advise him. The French bishops, abbots, and university doctors knew, however, what was best for them and advised their king to support the Pope in Avignon. The rest was then tit for tat. If France supported Clement, their enemy, the English, sided with Urban. Now, if the English sided with Urban, their enemies, the Scots, sided with Clement. The empire was a bit more of a complex place, with the House of Habsburg showing Clementine sympathies and the Luxembourgs following Roman obedience, as did Poland and Hungary. The Spanish kingdoms went for Avignon, which meant Portugal went for Rome, and so forth and so forth. Basically, the papal schism became part of the political fabric of Europe. Just another thing competing monarchs and princes could disagree on. Almost as soon as the schism had started, discussions began over how to end it. These discussions did not emanate from the papal courts, apart from demands that the respective other false pope step down, a proposal that obviously led nowhere. The leadership in the discussions therefore fell to the intellectuals of the day, which meant the doctors of the universities, and most senior amongst these, the University of Paris. Since the popes and their courts did not differ in their interpretation of scripture, the debate wasn't theological, but purely a question of canon law. And canon law, as we just heard, did not contain provisions for the deposition of a pope except for heresy, and either pope, for all their other failures, could be accused of heresy. Therefore, the simplest, if slowest option was to wait for one of the two pontiffs to die and then unify the church around the survivor. Urban VI was the first to die in 1389 after more than a decade of raging and renting, tormenting and torturing. He fell off a mule and never recovered. Now, he was not the most popular pope, and his sarcophagus almost ended up as a trough for the papal horses when St. Peter's was remodeled. But still, the opportunity to end the schism was lost, in part because King Wenceslas failed to prevent the cardinals from electing a successor to Urban VI, who took the name Boniface IX. In 1394 it was Clement VII, the Avignon pope's turn to bite the dust. This time, the powers to be reacted more quickly. The Royal Council of France sent a letter to Avignon demanding the cardinals were to refrain from electing a new pope. The letter arrived, but the cardinals ignored it. Instead, they elected Pedro de Luna as Pope Benedict XIII. That's the one Spaniard who had been at the conclave of 1378. The only not Benedict XIII gave to the royal demand came in the form of a solemn oath. that he would strive to resolve the schism even if that involved his own resignation. The policy of waiting for one pope to die clearly had not worked. The French government, with the support of its clergy and university, then pursued what they called the via sessionis, the idea being that both popes are to be made to resign at the same time. For that to work, the various monarchies supporting the two obediences needed to agree. And by 1397 it looked as that could be achieved. A truce with England was concluded that brought King Richard II on board. The other prominent supporter of the Roman pontiff was King Wenceslas IV. He too joined the coalition after that fatal meeting at Reims, where he spent most of his time in a state of drunken stupor. But hey, he seemed to have agreed. So delegations went out to Avignon and to Rome, demanding both popes resign. Guess what? Neither did. Now the French get really angry. If Benedict XIII wasn't willing to go voluntarily, then he needed to be forced. In 1398, France declared what they called a subtraction, i.e. they decided they would no longer recognize Benedict XIII as the legitimate pope. 13 of Benedict's cardinals crossed the Rhone and took with them the papal seal. But Benedict XIII was one of the most stubborn, if not the most mulish man ever. Even though he had lost his most important supporters, he did not budge. The increasingly exasperated French rulers resorted to military might and besieged the papal palace in Avignon. It had been a long time since the temporal ruler had besieged a pope. The last was probably Barbarossa's fateful siege of Rome in 1169. But still, Benedict XIII did not budge. The Palais des Papes, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, was as much fortress as it was palace, and even with guns, the French failed to take it. In the end, the two sides came to some awkward compromise. Benedict XIII was allowed to remain free in his palace in Avignon, but under house arrest. French soldiers patrolled the city and blocked the gates. This less than dignified situation lasted until 1402, when Benedict XIII escaped to Provence, where he found protection. Several of the Spanish kingdoms that had deserted him returned to his obedience. Even the cardinals trickled back into his camp, and in 1403 the Kingdom of France recognized him as the only pope again. Meanwhile, his adversary in Rome did not have a great time either. Boniface IX had inherited Urban's quarrels with the Kingdom of Naples, that included a variety of exceedingly cruel murders, sieges and battles, all again most unbecoming to a pontiff. Now that Benedict XIII was restored to power, he felt magnanimous, and he sent a proposal to Boniface IX. The two contenders should first refrain from making any new cardinals, and then meet in person and end the schism. Now, that did not happen because in 1404 Boniface IX died. Everybody, including the leading churchmen of both sides, had enough of the schism. The Roman cardinals therefore offered not to elect a new pope if Benedict XIII would resign. Fat chance that would happen. Did I mention that Benedict XIII was a bit stubborn? So the Roman cardinals had no other option than to elect another pope, Innocent VII, who had the decency to die a year later, providing another opportunity. Again, the cardinals on the two sides tried to get Benedict XIII to step down. Again, this intractable, pig-headed, obstinate Spaniard said no. But at least he offered to come to Italy to meet and discuss an abdication. As a stopgap, the Roman cardinals therefore elected Gregory XII, whose sole purpose was to resign as soon as a deal was struck. Benedict XIII indeed travelled to Italy to meet said Gregory XII at Savona. But on the appointed date, Gregory was not in Savona. He was 200 miles away in Siena. A new meeting was scheduled for Porto Venere. But again, on that day, Gregory was in Lucca. and so it went for another 2 or 3 times. Finally, Gregory XII dropped his guys and declared that, well, he would never resign anyway, and that his cardinals should stop scheduling these pointless meetings. Why did he do that? Well, not for any canon law or theological reason, but because his greedy family wanted more time to suck the papacy's treasury dry. That was too much for Gregory's cardinals, who left him, and they met up with Benedict XIII's cardinals, who too were realizing how totally intransigent their boss had become. Having exhausted every other possible avenue, the Church finally arrived at a solution that had already been proposed by 2 German theologians, Heinrich von Langenstein and Konrad von Gelnhausen. These had been the leading lights at the University of Paris and would later found the universities of Vienna and Heidelberg respectively. But way back in 1381, they had proposed to convene a church council to resolve the schism. At the time, this was rejected, as under canon law only a pope could convene a council. Heinrich and Konrad argued that it must be possible to convene a council in periods of the absence of a pope, for instance during the election period. And hence there must be circumstances a council can be convened without prior papal invitation. It took until 1409, after all the endless back and forth, the failed meetings, the broken promises, that the University of Paris came round to the view of their former deans. Papal invitation or not, the cardinals called a church council for March 1409 in Pisa. And this was a very impressive gathering, the largest church council since the Great Lateran Council of 1215. 24 cardinals from both obediences, 84 archbishops and bishops, plus the proxies of a further 102. 128 abbots and the proxies of 200 more, the general superiors of 4 monastic orders, as well as representative of 13 universities across Christendom. And of course, the ambassadors of all the great princes of Europe, except for the Scandinavians, Scots, Neapolitans and Spaniards. To the surprise of, well, pretty much no one, the council declared on June 5th, 1409, quote, "This sacred synod, acting for the universal church and as court in the present case against Peter de Luna and Angelo Corrario, once known as Benedict XIII and Gregory XII, decrees they were and are schismatics, nourishers of schism, and notorious heretics, and that they have deviated from the faith and have committed notorious crimes of perjury by violating their oaths. For these reasons and others, they have proved themselves unworthy of all honor and dignity, including those due to the papal office. This synod deprives, deposes, and excommunicates Peter and Angelo, and forbids them to act as supreme pontiff. This synod declares the Roman See vacant." End quote. Hooray! Fantastic! The schism is over. Both popes are deposed. All we need to do now is elect a new one, and Mother Church is at long last reunited. And that they did. The cardinals of both obediences holding hands in newfound unity, and as representative of the Church Council, elected Peter Filaggi, the Archbishop of Milan, who took the name Alexander V. The deed done, the Council declared to meet again in 3 years' time to debate much-needed church reform. Pope Alexander then proceeded to Bologna to receive the allegiance of the city, the largest in the papal dominion. Alexander V was 70 years of age, much younger than the recently deposed popes, which made it such a shock when he died shortly after entering Bologna. All could still have worked out fine had the cardinals accompanying Alexander V had chosen a more suitable successor. The one they chose was, however, Baldassare Cossa, a man of, let's say, checkered past. He had been a naval commander in his youth, and rumor had it that he did a spot of piracy on the side. Other stories went round about his fondness of the ladies. Whether he indeed had seduced 200 women in Bologna, as was claimed by his detractors, is however doubtful, purely on the grounds of time constraints. Then there were the questions around Alexander V's mysterious early death, the vast bribes paid to the electing cardinals, and so forth and so forth. John XXIII, as this new pope styled himself, entered Rome in 1411. The deposed Gregory XII cowered in the town of Gaeta, but held on to control over bits and bobs in Italy, the Empire, Poland and Lithuania. Meanwhile, Benedict XIII could still rely on the Spanish kingdoms and Scotland. Despite all the effort, the schism still was not over. In 1413, John XXIII lost his hold on Rome when the Neapolitans marched in. The Pisan Pope fled to Florence and began a peripatetic life that led him to Constance in 1414, where the next church council was to be held. But that is a story for another time. For now, we freeze at this point, where Europe has 3 popes. Next week, we will talk about what the implications of these shenanigans were for the relationship between church and state, the relationship between monarchs and their diets and parliaments, the defense of Europe against the Ottomans, and the way people thought about God and all that. If you want to pass the time until then by listening to old episodes, why not go back to the schism between Innocent II and Anaclet II in episode 46, or Barbarossa's fateful siege of Rome in episode 57. Before I go, let me just remind you that you can support the podcast by going to historyofthegermans.com/support, where you can either sign up as a patron or make a one-time donation. And just remember, from November, Apple will add a 30% surcharge should you sign up to Patreon on your iPhone. So either make a one-time donation right here, or go to your trusted old computer and go onto patreon.com/historyofthegermans there. I'll see you next week.